Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. Later today, of course, the January 6th committee will be having its hearing focusing on the role of extremists. And there's new polling out showing, at least the headline in the New York Times, is half of GOP voters ready to leave Trump behind. Poll finds. However, these things always come with a big asterisk. Trump maintains his primacy in the party. Hypothetical matchup against five other potential Republican rivals. 49% of primary voters said they would support him for a third nomination. So we know how this goes, but nobody knows how this goes better than our guest today. We are very, very lucky to have as our guest on the Bulwark podcast, Mark Leibovich, staff writer for The Atlantic, author of a blockbuster new book out today. Thank you for your servitude, Donald Trump's Washington and the Price of Submission. So first of all, congratulations on the book, and thanks for coming on the podcast, Mark.
It's a pleasure, Charlie. And, everything I'm saying here is sort of in the seed corn of the Bulwark and everything you've been saying for the last 6-7 years. So I applaud you right back for that.
Well, thank you. So let's just dive right in. Right before we began the podcast, you mentioned the chicken, the egg, the fundamental question that we keep coming back to about Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party. And you correct me if I get this question wrong, but basically the question is Donald Trump dominant in the Republican Party because he's just so darn popular, or is he so popular because so many other Republicans refuse to stand up to him and in fact wave the white flag? What is the answer to that question? It feels like the circular question that we keep coming back to again and again and again.
It is. My answer to that is extremely slanted to the latter, to the fact, the white flag theory. This whole book is basically about the white flag theory, being that if the GOP weren't comprised of so many just shameless, very weak toadies who just have sort of thrown in with this guy over time or immediately and just over and over and over again, he wouldn't have survived all the things that he did. And look, if there were a dozen Liz Cheneys, I don't know if they would be as gifted as Liz Cheney, because Liz Cheney, I think, has done everything right the last few months. But if there were more of them, if they were sustained, if Marco Rubio, if Kevin McCarthy, if Mitch McConnell really started a pretty profound drumbeat, within a few days of the last election, this nightmare would be behind the Republican Party. And make no mistake, this is a nightmare for the Republican Party. It might be enough to sort of push them over the finish line in this midterm in a very, very weak environment for Biden, obviously. The Democrats have a host of problems. But look, I think they've created this mess, and the mess continues because they have done nothing to stop it.
So many of our listeners may have read your earlier book, the classic This Town. That's the 2012 book about Washington. And the way you've described it is about Washington at its seemingly grossest and most decadent. It was the pre-Trump capital of operatives, former office holders, minor celebrity journalists, and Democrats and Republicans promising change only to get co-opted and never leave. So I guess, has Washington changed, or was this the Washington that was just ripe to be co-opted by a charlatan like Donald Trump?
Donald Trump really perfected one thing, which was what it means to run against Washington. Barack Obama ran against Washington. George W. Bush ran against Washington. Bill Clinton ran against Washington. Ronald Reagan ran against Washington. Donald Trump took it up, as he does, to 11. What he did was he gave sort of cartoon, imagery to what Washington was. He actually called them the sleazeball capitalist, pointy-headed. He would go after like Charles Krauthammer and Karl Rove in very personal terms. And he just really said, these are really corrupt, terrible people. Not a lot subtle about Donald Trump, right? And that's sort of what he did. He sort of applied the project of running against Washington to the Trump model. And it took, along with his other, I don't know if superpowers is the right word, but his shamelessness, his survival instinct, his willingness to say anything. And lo and behold, he sort of was seen as the drain the swamp guy, when in fact, as I said before, that's sort of a derivative concept. That's a cliche that goes back decades. So, but I think Donald Trump, if he has another skill, it's to seize weakness in people or recognize weakness in people and then sort of exploit it to his ends and do it for as far as he can take it.
So he looked at this Washington establishment and he saw weak, opportunistic throne sniffers and
Mm-hmm.
has exploited that, because that really is the
Yes.
story. I mean, the theme of your book is Donald Trump's Washington and the price of submission. And all of these folks who he ran against, in fact, turned out to be pretty much what he thought they were. I think
Yeah.
with his reptilian instinct that if he bullied them and he rolled them, that they would come,
Yeah.
to kiss the ring, right?
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of the early reporting for this book took place in 2016. And, it seems like 30 years ago, but it really was when the foundation for all of this was laid. And first of all, I spent like 3 solid weeks with Trump for a New York Times Magazine profile I
Mhm.
did on him. I think that was actually late 15. And, it was just, he was very generous with his time and access. He did not, it was refreshing at the time. But I remember once I said, he looked at me and said, yeah, I'm going to win. You know why I'm going to win? All these guys on the stage with me, and this was right after a debate, they're weak. I will bend them to my will. It might take a while, but look at them. They're going to, I will, I'm used to guys 20 times tougher than him in New York real estate. I thought it was bluster and so forth. He turned out to be right. And look, and if you sort of look at the way Marco Rubio was talking in like March, April of 2016, a completely defeated man, so upset, saying, this is a strong man. This is we're going to be regretting this for years. No way I'm coming back to the Senate. He wasn't going to run. Then he
Mhm.
sort of decided, oh, wait a minute, where's my parking space? And I need to run again. So he ran again. Ted Cruz, who I actually thought gave a very ballsy speech at
Mhm.
the Republican convention in Cleveland. And I remember I got really pissed off with the media. The media was like, oh, what a terrible disaster for Ted Cruz. He was booed off stage and Heidi Cruz was hounded out of the arena.
Yeah.
And oh, this is a bad look. This could end his career. And I'm like, wait a minute. First of all, he's sort of playing Trump's game. He's doing the professional wrestling heel turn thing. And, who's the worst heel here, right? But look, it was, there are worse things to have on your bumper sticker than, vote your conscience, which was his sort of takeaway line from that. And then, he flipped rather dramatically, as Rubio did, as
Rather
Lindsey did.
dramatically.
The whole crew. So in that sense, Trump, was proven 100% correct.
So you mentioned that when you spoke to Rolling Stone that you did not want to write a Trump book because Lord knows
No.
there have been enough Trump books. What you wanted to do is write a book about the people that permitted it. And I think this is the extraordinary thing about the last few years is if you take the focus off of Donald Trump, who's frankly, look, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. He's living his best life.
Right.
He's a billionaire. He's married to a supermodel. He flies around in his own jet. He's the
Yep.
president, right? He does what he does. The extraordinary thing is that people who look at him who completely recognized who and what he is, decided to basically submit to him. And this continues to be just a fascinating question. And people say, well, it's because they're cowardly or because it's the money or because they're whatever. It's actually more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is. There are many layers to the reasoning here. I think one thing you just can't discount is physical intimidation. There was a great
Hmm.
story. Tim Alberta, my colleague at the
Mhm.
Atlantic, had a great story in the Atlantic on Peter Meyer, who was the he's a sort of a very, I think, freshman congressman, Republican
Yep.
from Michigan, wealthy guy. Meyer, what convenience stores is it? I think it was. I assume
Yeah.
it's in
Grocery
Wisconsin.
stores. Yeah, they're
Grocery
everywhere.
stores.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he was one of the 10 impeachment voters in the House, the Republican
Mhm.
impeachment voters. And you had like freshman Republicans and young Republicans coming up to him, just not knowing what to do. Of course, we're going to vote for certification because that's what everyone has always done. And there's no reason not to. But all of a sudden, you have Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Jim Jordan and Paul Gosar saying, no way we're voting for certification. And then, Trump makes it a requirement and McCarthy jumps on board. And all of a sudden you have these people saying, well, I got to vote against certification because I'm worried about my family and we're getting these death threats and I got kids and like I don't have a big security detail. I just have like a couple of aides
Mhm.
and I just can't do it. I'm worried about my family. And so they did. And, to me, that's sort of a straight ahead thing that just gets missed. But that is the definition of authoritarianism. That is leadership by fear. That is not by debate, not by politics. It's just, don't do this and you or your family could be at risk. So there is that. I think people like Lindsey Graham, people like Marco Rubio have learned that they need to be, to use Lindsey's word, relevant. We need to be relevant. And, Lindsey gets some
It's a
real
fetish. It's
psychological
a kink.
fetish.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, can't I love when you use that word. It's a great word. But no, I mean, it's there is real sort of warped kind of way spiritual nourishment that they get from in Lindsey's case being on a golf course with Donald Trump, getting to come back as a senator from Florida, Texas, wherever you're from, and I don't know. There's also a path of least resistance here too. It's just like, okay, I'm just going to keep my head down.
Well, I've thought about this a lot, that the founding fathers obviously thought that there were certain checks upon an out of control executive, including, the jealousy of a co-equal branch of government, that United States
Mhm.
senators, for example, Congress, would not want to think of themselves as potted plants or as
Right.
supplicants, that they would push back, number one. And then secondly, and I think this feels very naive now to say this, but you
Mhm.
explored this in great detail, that it would also be just the sense of one's legacy, how one
Right.
would appear in history, that there would be a conscience that would say, this is wrong. I don't want to be remembered as as an ass kisser. I don't want to be
Yeah.
remembered as somebody that just rolled over.
Mhm.
Obviously, you have these senators who are willing to surrender in terms of institutional jealousy. But to
Right.
this question about legacy, which you asked over and over again, you asked Lindsey
Yeah.
Graham, you asked Kevin McCarthy about all of this. They, well, talk to me about this, because this strikes me as the central question behind the
Mhm.
book. Correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote the book because you wanted to say, why did you do this? And aren't you concerned how you will be remembered? Is this really the story you want to tell your grandkids? Right? I mean, that's kind of the central question.
Absolutely. I mean, that was like what you just said, sort of, why are you doing this? How do you want to be remembered? And then the third sort of question or sort of statement at the core of this was they all knew better.
Right.
But I mean, to a person, they all expressed such sort of laughing, mocking contempt to the idea of legacy. I mean, I would ask people, how do you want to be remembered? Or do you worry that you will be sort of seen as the guy who lied for Trump or the guy who propped up Donald Trump? And they would look at me like I had two heads. I mean, I remember Kevin McCarthy was very dismissive of the question. He kind of ignored it. And he said, "What'd you ask me again?" And we were eating ice cream in Bakersfield last year at some point. I said, how do you want to be remembered? Legacy. He goes, "Oh, you mean like the Jeff Flake question?" And I'm like, "What?" He goes, everyone says, "Oh, Jeff Flake, what a great hero." Jeff Flake, of course, longtime House guy, senator from Arizona,
Mhm.
a critic of Trump, wound up, being unviable as a reelection
Mhm.
candidate in Arizona, quit, and is not in the Senate anymore. But McCarthy said, where's his statue at the Capitol? Are people going to remember him forever? So anyway, he had contempt for it. Rudy said this a million different ways in a million different interviews. Trump himself said it. Bill Barr said it. Lindsey said it. I mean, they just real contempt for the notion that there was anything beyond the day-to-day expediencies of pleasing Donald Trump and sort of winning the day, to use sort of the old sort of Politico playbook back at the inception expression. But no, great contempt.
Great contempt. So why? Is it because they just think that there is no historical memory, or because they think they'll get to write their own history? Why would anyone, a grown up, somebody in this position, not think about how they will be remembered, what their grandchildren will think?
I mean, I think a lot of them are very limited psychological and intellectual thinkers in
Oh,
some ways. I
okay.
mean, I think people like Trump and Rudy are somewhat desperate older guys who were never terribly reflective to begin with. You have McCarthy, who I don't think has a lot of bandwidth, in either of those categories. Emotionally, intellectually, self knowledge, and so forth. And he's just sort of convinced himself that if he can become speaker, it's all redeemed. Nothing else matters. Trump, I wouldn't call a paragon of psychological health. So you have a lot of that. But one thing I have found is sort of the people who have, I think, performed admirably and who do have sort of history in the back of their mind and doing the right thing in the back of their mind are often people who are in legacy political families with a keen sense of history. Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, both are children of very
Mhm.
prominent and also principled politicians. Also, people of faith. I mean, Romney's in that category. Jeff Flake's in that category. Even like what's his name, Rusty,
Lucy Bowers.
yeah,
Yeah.
Rusty Bowers
Mhm.
in that category. And then a lot of military people. You have people who have seen war up close, who have fought, valiantly for the country. Whether it's Adam Kinzinger or John McCain, and I mean, so those are the three kind of recurring categories. And then you have like a lot of career sort of business people or sort of very opportunistic politicians. McCarthy, Graham, Trump, who tend not to allow themselves to think beyond the blinders of just, again, getting what's in front of them and sort of achieving whatever the goal that they need to achieve is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a contrast between people who have sort of an independent identity versus those who are completely derivative, the pilot fish, who need to draw their meaning and their celebrity from someone else. Speaking of which,
Yeah, right.
let's drill down on all of this, because your portrait of Lindsey Graham is just a classic. That when it came to Graham, no one worked harder at caring less. Losing weight is just about impossible when you can't control those cravings throughout the day. You know that. Salty snacks or sweet treats are always within reach. And what about the temptation at all those summer barbecues? Well, the new weight control formula from Nusu Labs uses biohacking technology to curb your appetite and help control those unwanted cravings. Formulated with natural ingredients and antioxidants, this new weight control formula helps you maximize a healthy metabolism and keep you away from all those empty calories safely, naturally, and without the side effects of restrictive diets and supplements. And this one-of-a-kind formula has the same mood-enhancing ingredient in dark chocolate to help keep you from getting hangry. Nusu guarantees you'll lose up to 3 pounds in the first week, guaranteed, or your money back. Now, you can try Nusu's weight control risk-free at nusulabs.com/bulwark. That's Nusu Labs, NUSULABS.com/bulwark. Enter Bulwark and get an extra 20% off of your first order. And every order includes a free digital diet planner to keep track of your goals. That's nusulabs.com/bulwark, nusulabs.com/bulwark. These statements and products have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or condition. These statements and information are not a substitute for or alternative to seeking care from your healthcare providers. You write that this is not a Trump book because it's about the people that enabled Trump. That you didn't find Trump that captivating as a standalone character. Far more compelling to you were the slavishly devoted Republicans whom Trump drew to his side. And I, of course, share this. So let's talk about, Kevin. We talked about Kevin McCarthy, Lindsey Graham. They had long been among the most supplicant super careerists ever to play in a city known for the breed and prove themselves to be the essential lapdogs in Trump's kennel. They are classically Washington types, fun to be around, starstruck, desperate to keep their jobs or get better ones. So tell me a little bit about Lindsey Graham, because I remember that moment of sort of cognitive, surprise when he moved from being John McCain's closest friend to, it felt like almost instantaneously, being Trump's most eager golf buddy.
Yeah, it really, first of all, the speed with which he would just go from John McCain's deathbed essentially to Donald Trump's backside,
Yeah.
it was just remarkable. I mean, and there was some overlap, and McCain himself was not happy about it. I mean, their relationship was not perfect by the end by any means, and he, I think he expressed quite a bit to Lindsey what, how he felt about what he was doing, and he said, it's beneath you. And so forth. So, and look, you mentioned a pilot fish. I mean, that's an image that actually I saw, I think, originally on a tweet from Steve Schmidt, of all people. Yeah. And I think he described Lindsey as a pilot fish. And basically, a pilot fish is someone who lives off the detritus of the larger kingfish, right? In the case of John McCain, Lindsey was the professional sidekick to John McCain, and he wrote it to great fame and political. I mean, he had a blast. He was always at John McCain's side, and then Trump was the next guy. I mean, Graham himself said that he's always looking for alpha dogs. He said that in his own memoir. One of the things about writing a book like this, by the way, is you read memoirs that no one else is going to read or you would never have read otherwise. But you can mine things that are original source material, and it's like, wow, actually, that is worthwhile. But no, I mean, so a lot of politicians, even very successful and famous politicians, are purely derivative characters. And, Lindsey Graham is sort of the ultimate at this point because he's a powerful, very prominent, very visible Republican senator, very relevant, to use his term, largely because of his relationship with Donald Trump. If that goes away, he's just another sort of non-leadership Republican in the Senate at this point.
So I think the most interesting way you describe Graham is saying that he's always saying how important it was to get the joke about Trump, getting the joke. That's an
Yeah,
old time-worn Washington expression. But what does
correct.
Lindsey Graham mean when he says, you need to get the joke?
Yeah, I mean the joke always changes, and there are different jokes for different contexts, right? But when I was writing this town, I mean the joke was, oh, Tom Daschle and Trent Lott are in business together because they get the joke. They know that they might have been bitter adversaries for however many years in the Senate, but now that they're out of office, they got the same agent. They have a lot. They share a lot of clients. They're
Yeah,
making $10
yeah.
million. So that was the joke then, back in those sort of harmless halcyon
Mhm.
days
Yep.
of the early teens.
So much more innocent. Yeah.
So much more innocent. I mean, comedy of manners.
Mhm.
The joke now, I think, overwhelmingly within the Republican Party is that most of them know better. I mean, the ones who are elected to office all know better. They know that Donald Trump is at best not fit to be president, at worst, a, sort of just criminally dangerous imbecile. And, but they don't, of course, you can never say that in public, but they
But
all sort of know it.
that's the joke.
That's the joke. The joke is something you can't, it's a sort of an understood truth that is best not said, certainly not on the record. And, there's a critical mass of like taped stuff now of people actually saying what they really feel, that gets out in ways that they didn't want to. I mean, there was actually a great example in I think it was in the Bulwark, right? Ron Johnson, after
Yep.
the election, I think it was an activist who
Yeah.
taped a conversation, and he said, well, if I said the election was won by Joe Biden, it would be career suicide or something. And, Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns in their book, they had McCarthy on tape. I mean, there's a fairly extensive body of work, that speaks to this directly.
So you actually write about this, the gap between the public adoration expressed by Trump's Republican lickspittles, I love that word,
Hmm.
and the mocking
Hmm.
contempt they voice for him in private could be gaping.
Absolutely.
So does Trump get the joke? Does he know that he is the joke?
I asked Graham that. He said, "Oh, absolutely, he gets the joke. You should come to dinner with us." And then I wrote, "I was never invited to
Mm.
dinner." Um, Now, look, it's unclear if Donald Trump would define the joke the way I just did, right, or the way Lindsey would. I mean, I do think that there have been instances where Trump has acknowledged that this is, get a load of this act. I mean, Bill Barr said
Yeah.
when his book came out that, Trump always said the tweets have to have just enough crazy in them, knowing that, if he went too far, it might have backlash. If he didn't go far enough, it would be boring. And I remember, again, when I spent all this time with Trump in the campaign, he knows exactly where lines are. He does, I think, know what he's doing, which I guess speaks to him maybe getting the joke. But he would toggle between off and on the record all the time. Like he would say something really kind of out there, and then he'd go off the record and he'd say, "Oh my," and he'd say something that was wildly irresponsible that obviously I can't repeat, but
Mhm.
it's just yeah. So he kind of knows what he's doing, but I also think that ultimately he's a dangerous character.
Well, I mean, you quote Adam Kinzinger, telling you that, the vast majority in DC get the joke, including people like McCarthy and Graham. But the problem is the joke isn't even funny anymore. So the
Yeah,
we're in the midst of this investigation at January 6th, which is not funny at all.
right.
Where you had the president, this deranged president, pushing the big lie and the attack on the Capitol. And yet people like Lindsey Graham and Kevin McCarthy are absolutely unmoved by this. They still, quote unquote, get the joke. What is the joke there for them?
uh, again, these are not terribly deep thinkers on these
Yeah.
issues, but I would say that again, McCarthy would just very very kind of put blinders on and say, "Speaker, I want to be speaker. I'll put up with all the crap I need to, all the indignity I need to, all the ridicule, scorn I need to. I don't care anyway because I just raised $200 million for the Republican, the House Republicans in their real life. So that's his thing. Graham, again, he needs two things in his life. One, to be in the U.S. Senate. I mean, I think one of his colleagues said to me, there's no one who needs to be here more desperately than Lindsey Graham, and this is a friend. But he doesn't have a family. He doesn't have
He has
much
no
of a
life.
sort of foundation outside of his life in the Senate. And also, he needs to be relevant. He needs to be at the dice table, as he says, right? I mean, John McCain's always saying John McCain's favorite game with dice. It becomes addictive. You want to be sort of in the middle of things, and being on the golf course with Donald Trump is the price of submission for him. It keeps him relevant. It keeps him getting up in the morning, I guess.
Well, a lot of these people did talk to you, and you told Vanity Fair that you weren't sure why people talked to him for the interviews over the past 3 or 4 years, although
I've been saying that for years. I mean, I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, seriously, like 20 years covering politics. I wrote a book on the NFL a few years ago, and all these,
Mhm.
I got a lot of access, and it was like, why haven't they like Googled you? But I don't know, I guess I just have this irresistible. I mean, people have either a sadistic, desire to embarrass themselves, or I just have this charm. Who knows?
Or they think they have the superpower of being able to, "Look, I will charm these other folks." So
Right.
you also talk about, since we're talking about Lindsey Graham and Kevin McCarthy, you also write about, Marco Rubio or Elise Stefanik.
Mm.
And when you see them on TV, you wrote there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. You said that you think they respect the hell out of Liz Cheney, but at the same time, they made the decision they needed to. That is kind of interesting. Do you think Elise Stefanik really does still, or has she managed to
Yeah.
shove that down so far? I mean,
Oh, I don't.
how does it work?
Yeah, I don't doubt that they've shoved it down really, really
Mhm,
far. No, don't get me wrong, but
mhm.
no, look, these are smart. These are smart and serious people, and they made a different choice. And they all respect the hell out of Liz Cheney just based on what they
Huh.
said about her as recently as 2 years ago. Okay, I mean, Elise Stefanik. I mean, Liz Cheney was her idol in the
Mhm.
House, right? And I mean, Elise Stefanik, first of all, I think was quite overrated a couple of years ago. I mean, I
Sure.
remember I was doing a story on Paul Ryan in
Yeah.
2018, and my first exposure to her was they kind of queued up Elise Stefanik as like a great Paul Ryan Republican. She's trying to get women into the party. She was a big Rubio supporter in 2016, and I interviewed her. She was terrible. I mean, it was a terrible interview.
Really? Yeah.
But then I remember thinking, all right, well, she's on that first impeachment committee. Maybe this will be her time to shine. And I remember being in the room and just sort of watching her and just feeling my heart drop. I'm like, oh, she's that person now. She really must want this number 3 job. But look, I don't know. I mean, I will say this about Liz Cheney. She, I think, is one of the most admired politicians in the country right now. I mean, she just got a standing ovation at the Reagan Library 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks after she got a standing ovation at the Kennedy Library. 2 weeks before that, as she received the Profile and Courage Award. Now, you could say,
Mhm.
okay, coastal, elites, okay, Simi Valley, Boston, who cares? What's that going to get you among the tiny, electorate of Wyoming? Very well could get her beat. But you do sort of wonder if there is a place that a lot of these people have where they would switch places with her if they could. Not that they ever would have, but I mean, it's quite a thought exercise that I obviously don't get answers to.
Well, you sat down with her, and she told you, and I think accurately, by the way, that one of the decisive moments in this whole process of submission was Kevin McCarthy's visit down to Mar-a-Lago
Mm,
after January 6th, and she said that when we look back, Kevin's trip to Mar-a-Lago will turn out to be a key moment. And she
yeah.
said it would go down as one of the most shameful episodes in one of the country's most shameful chapters. Because more than anybody, McCarthy ensured that the Republican Party would remain stuck in this post-election purgatory. I
Mm,
mean, so I guess there's a parallel here. Lindsey Graham, the night of January 6th, or was it the
hmm
morning of January 7th, said, I'm
mm,
finished. I am done with Trump. Kevin McCarthy, clearly was disgusted, said things
hmm
about Trump. So, and yet within days, both of them had flipped back. What
mm.
happened? What was that dynamic? Because that is so central to everything we're
Yeah.
talking about right now.
It really is. I mean, first of all, one of the most overused but also pertinent expressions we've heard over the last few years is off ramp. Okay.
Yeah,
Access
I-
Hollywood is going to be
I've
the
used
off
it.
ramp.
Yeah,
Yeah, we all have. I mean, that's, people are going to give up on Trump after Access Hollywood is their off ramp.
yeah,
Then, okay, he lost the
yeah,
election.
yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
the defeat. Yes.
Defeat,
Yeah.
3 days later. It's like, I mean, first of all, I mean, Republicans stood by Richard Nixon until they didn't. I mean, the reason he actually walked away, I mean, he could have, if he had Fox News and he had as supplicant a Republican Party as Trump does now, who knows if Nixon could have survived. But I mean, there was a seminal moment where, first of all, there were some very surprising defections in the House, mainly the father of Larry Hogan, who was
Mhm.
kind of a backbencher from Maryland, sort of said, yeah, I'm voting for the impeachment articles, first Republican to do so. And then, Barry Goldwater and a few other leaders in the House, Republicans, walked over to the White House and said, Mr. President, it's over. And that was it. I mean, if Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and Lindsey Graham and a couple of other prominent senators walked over to the White House and said, "Mr. President, it's over. Would things have changed if they had all sort of said publicly immediately what everyone knew to be true, what they knew to be true public?" I mean, that was an off ramp. But if that wasn't January 6th, I mean, oh my God, you remember how people were talking in those days? I mean, it was stunning. I mean, it wasn't just the stuff caught on tape, it was everyone. And, I do think people, including me, emphasize and sort of deconstruct the Mar-a-Lago visit. I have that visual attached to it that's particularly pathetic. But, Mitch McConnell should get more blame than I think he does. He wanted to impeach. He wanted to convict. He wanted this done. He wanted the Democrats to sort of lead on it. He said, "We're going to take care of the son of a bitch." That was in the Martin Burns book. And he said, "Well, wait a minute, though. We're not going to do an impeachment because we have like a week, but we'll just wait till after the election." And you could have done it in a few days. I mean, they all lived through that. It's not like it's not like the case wasn't made, right? But apparently enough Republicans got to him saying, we don't want to take this vote. So he goes, "All right, we're going to kick it to after the election," at which point everyone had the built-in excuse, well, he's a former
After
president.
the inauguration.
Yeah. So, I mean, and so McConnell, basically queued that up. And then a week later, he's like, "Of course I will support the nominee in 2024 if it's Donald Trump." So, again, this all happens before the end of January, pretty much. I mean, it might have bled into February a little bit.
Well, it was 8 days, right? I mean, it was
8 days.
McCarthy was at Mar-a-Lago 8 days after he, claimed that he asked Trump to resign. 8 freaking days.
8 freaking days. Yeah. It was, I remember, I think it was Adam Schiff who said to me, "I feel like we lost the country twice in the last 5 years. One was when Trump was elected, and two, when everyone just decided to fold their tents like just a few days after January 6th. And it was like, oh, there's more of this."
So this goes back to exactly where we began. This question. Did this happen because Trump is so overwhelmingly powerful, or because they all surrendered? So let's do a counterfactual. If in fact Kevin McCarthy would have stood up, if in fact Mitch McConnell would have done his duty, and Lindsey Graham would have stayed off the reservation, if other people, if everybody, all of these leaders, if they had led the way to the off ramp, how would history have been different? How would our current moment be different if they had done that?
I think he'd have to leave. I mean, he would have no option. There probably wouldn't be a January 6th. I mean, it would not be clean by any stretch. I mean, maybe Trump would have some kind of, I shouldn't say that about January 6th. I mean, I have no doubt that Trump would try to orchestrate some wildly irresponsible, potentially violent event around his rejection. But, he is someone who he takes what is given. He takes what's allowed, right? And I just think if the party said we're done, he would have been done. I mean, he might have broken away and said, "All right, we now have a Trump party," and Ronna McDaniel would have freaked out, and Kevin McCarthy would have freaked out, and the party might be in real short-term trouble, but ultimately, it would be something resembling the Republican Party that a lot of people grew up with, and that there are parts of the Republican Party that I think are extremely vital, important to the legacy of the country, and conservatism for starters, and I think it's just sort of gone.
Well, this is what's painful about the question, because if they would have done the pivot, say on January 7th, and stuck with it, he would be gone. There would have been a fracturing of the party, at least short term, but then they would have pivoted, as they always do, into being anti-Biden. And of course, now we know that Biden's given them plenty of material. So their fracturing would have come together being in opposition is what they do the best, being in opposition. So they would be looking at these midterms as a Biden referendum, as opposed to Trump hanging over them. And that's what I want to talk about, where the Republican Party is right now with Trump. But before we move on to the current state of the Republican Party, we've been talking about the price of submission. We've talked about the real sycophants, the real turd polishers in the Trump war. But Paul Ryan. Talk to me about Paul Ryan, because you have a dazzling detail in your book about Paul Ryan telling you that he was sobbing while he watched January 6th. So where do you put Paul Ryan in this whole process?
There is a continuum here, right? I mean, Paul Ryan, better than Kevin McCarthy, worse than John McCain, right? I mean, it's not that simple. I mean, these are human beings, right? And Paul
Right.
Ryan, deeply flawed. I think a lot of people were disappointed in him as speaker in the first 2 years. I think both from the right and from the left, obviously. It was a tough job. It was an impossible job. He didn't like the job, and ultimately he quit the job. And he sort of became, he became a bystander. Basically, he left.
Mhm.
He went into private life, and I've known him over the years. I mean, I knew him when he was Mitt
Mhm.
Romney's running mate. I spent a lot of time with him in 2018 during his last months in office. I mean, you've obviously known him longer, Charlie, but it's, he's seen this. I mean, he's young, still relatively, but he's been really present at the inception of all this.
And the
I sort of,
destruction, you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I visited him a couple months ago in his, I guess we were in a restaurant somewhere, and he told me this, and he said, "Look, it was a devastating thing to watch," and I just sort of, my emotions sort of boiled over, and there I was sobbing. I mean, I'm not John Boehner. I was like, I'm not a crier, but there I was, and I saw my old security detail getting beat up, and I wrote them all emails because I figured they weren't getting any love, and he a lot of his friends were injured, and just a lot of them just freaked out. And at some point, I just said, were any of these tears of complicity? I mean, could you have done more? Should you have done more when you were speaker? I mean, yes, you got tax reform done, but maybe do you think about that? And he said, yeah, he didn't want to go there really. And then, of course, he's on the Fox News board, right?
Yes, right.
Which is the ongoing thing. And I don't know how much money they're paying him, but he's still there. And to me, that's a really hard thing to reconcile
Did
from the
you ask him
president.
about that?
I did. I did. He didn't want to go there.
He just didn't wanna talk
So
about it. See,
didn't
this is
want to talk
this is
about
the thing about Paul, is that Paul's instincts are good. He
it. Hmm.
sees this, and I don't doubt that story, that he reacted
Hmm.
that way, and then the question is, "And then what?" And then what did you do? You're on the
Yeah.
Fox board. Did you speak out? I mean, you're a
Hmm.
major voice in the Republican Party, unless you feel that you're not anymore, or whatever.
Yeah.
He could have said these things publicly at the time. He could have said it forcefully at the time. He could have been one of these thought leaders, back then,
Hmm.
pushing the off ramp, or as a member of the Fox board. When Tucker Carlson began doing the revisionist history of January 6th, that would have been a moment, right, to draw a red
Wow.
line. I mean,
You
this
would think.
this is somebody who used to be. I mean, I used to introduce him at various events,
Yeah.
saying how extraordinary it is that we have this intellectual leader of the Republican Party who is also
Right.
the most powerful, Republican speaker. This is an
Yeah.
extraordinary moment, and that just seems, wow, that seems so
Yeah.
last
I mean,
century now.
look, there are certain people who are not suited to the moment. Paul Ryan's sort of a classic example who is not suited to this particular moment. He's much more suited to 2010. Whatever that was, right?
Yeah.
Maybe before, maybe when Jack Kemp. He had
Hmm?
all those idols. The supply side idols and so forth. It's funny. The answers I've heard him give on the Fox thing, and he sort of gave me a variation of this, was something to the effect of, well, I'm one of the adults in the room. It's important to have, same thing you would hear about the White House. I'm like, oh, yes, I'm in the White House, but I'm trying to like have a moderating effect on Donald Trump. And you should see all the things that I've
Right.
prevented. I mean, and Ryan used to say that all the time when he was speaker. He said, and he said this on the record to me, I think in 18, he said, well, I can say that I prevented that tragedy and that tragedy and that tragedy. I'm
Mhm.
like, wait, what tragedies are you talking about, Speaker, Mr. Speaker? And he goes, well, I've already said too much. I think that's in the book too.
Okay, so how do you feel about this whole, I was the adult in the room, the rationalization of people in the Trump organ? Because, one of the
Yeah.
things we're learning about, January 6th is, thank goodness we did have some adults in the room. We did have
Mm-hmm.
those folks from the DOJ. We did have Pat Cipollone in the room.
Yeah.
On the other hand, my sense is that a lot of the people who told themselves they were the adults in the room actually were just telling themselves a convenient story to rationalize going along with all of this. So how do you feel about the
Yeah.
rationalizers versus the people who really were making a difference?
I think I think they're a lot of the same in some ways. I mean, I've had a little bit of an evolution on my contempt, or maybe my contempt for the adults in the room types. My first reaction was, all right, great. You're just justifying it. I don't believe that you're pushing back all that hard in private. And I think I don't believe Kevin McCarthy pushes back in private against Donald Trump the way he claims he is. But, as a practical matter, as we're learning more about what happened between January 6th and, well, maybe between January, say, 1st and, January 20th, the sort of adults in the room became sort of the land the plane types, meaning we just got to do everything possible to get to January 20th. And Lindsey, I wouldn't know if I'd say to his credit, but he was definitely a land the plane type. He was working pretty closely with Ivanka, with Meadows, with McConnell, I guess. I mean, McConnell had his own interests, the Georgia Senate runoff. But we said we got to keep him occupied. We got to keep him feeling good about himself. I mean, it was classic toddler in chief stuff, right? Dan Dresner, shout out.
Yeah.
But it was like, okay, we're going to send him to the border so he can do like a sort of chest thumping rally about how much wall he's built, which of course is bullshit because Obama built more wall. But, we got to keep him occupied, get to January 20th, land the plane. That was a big Mark Milley line, right? And, to me, that was an important and very precarious time in Washington. I mean, I lived in Washington for a quarter century. That was scarier than after 9/11. I mean, that was, Al-Qaeda was some sort of, or the terrorists were sort of like a dark, shady enemy somewhere. I mean, the guy everyone was scared of was sitting in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And God knows what he'd do. And we now know what he was trying to do. So, I do think in very acute circumstances like that, I am not going to rule out the fact that people like Lindsey could be real forces for good. But, does that excuse everything else? I don't think so. But, so I guess my thinking's evolved a little bit on that. But mostly I think it's an excuse and I think it's bullshit.
So you mentioned how alarming that period was, and we're learning, every day about how serious this attempt to overturn the election was, how obsessed Donald Trump was, and the January 6th committee is laying out all of this evidence. We'll get more today. We'll get more next week as well. What effect, if any, is this having on the Republican electorate / establishment? And you can interpret that any way you like. As this is coming out, are they paying it? I mean, look, there's obviously different answers. I mean, some people aren't paying attention anymore. Is it creating, do you get any sense that it's creating the sense of like maybe now would be a good time to move on? Or are they just so locked in that nothing makes a difference anymore?
First of all, I do think it's making a difference. And I did not expect that I would be saying this a month or two ago.
I agree.
I mean, there's some very, very, I think, revealing poll numbers that say, I mean, Trump's culpability on this and people's caring about this in some recent polling is much higher than I would have thought. And I think part of that is just how well done these things have been. I mean, they just all sat back and it's been I think a model hearing. And the witnesses have been compelling. The witnesses have been Republicans. The witnesses have been, they've been elected officials. They've been nobodies. They've been, Cassidy Hutchinson. They've been the nameless election worker in Georgia. I mean, it's Rusty Bowers. I mean, so forth. So, I think they have really moved the needle. I don't. I mean, what would really move the needle, though? I mean, I do think that there is kind of an avalanche effect here, and Pat Cipollone is probably more likely to testify after Cassidy Hutchinson, and who knows who else could come forward. I just think if a fairly normal, kind of high profile, but not that high profile member of Congress or the Senate just said, you know what, I've had enough. I think what they're doing is great. I think we need to look at this, talk about this. Say if John Cornyn, I mean, random name out of John Cornyn or anyone else, just sort of said, John Cornyn said, I think that this is disqualifying. I think this is appalling. I think we need to be paying attention to this. I think this is something that's more important than really anything else. I mean, certainly more important than like Hunter Biden's laptop or whatever. I mean, this is an outrage. And sometimes, and I've sort of, in doing this book, I've researched a lot of how authoritarian regimes and how cults sort of break up. And usually it's just sort of over time, and there are quiet defections here and there. And, there are big developments, but mostly it's the people you don't expect. It's the Larry Hogan's dad during Watergate. It's the Cassidy Hutchinsons now, maybe. I don't know. But I do think that the idea that no Republican in the House or Senate has dared say anything about what we're seeing in these hearings is just a stunning indictment. And I also think it's getting increasingly untenable, given the mountain of evidence we're seeing presented and the compellingness of the witnesses.
So is it a sort of a break the glass thing though that when somebody does it that others will follow?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Boris
again,
Johnson said, "When the herd moves, it moves." You know,
exactly. I mean, yeah. I mean, the unwillingness of the herd to move in the Republican Party has been stunning to me. And I've been sort of saying this. It's not like examples of courageous behavior and character are not all around us among conservatives, whether it's Cassidy Hutchinson or Rusty Bowers or the British conservatives saying, all right, enough's enough here. And outside of political context, I mean, Ukraine, right? I mean, I remember I was writing the end of this book, and my last visit to the Trump Hotel was the night the Russian invasion commenced, and everyone was watching these explosions on the soundless TVs at the Trump Hotel, and it was like, wow, okay, so this is what a tyrant does, and Vladimir Putin will do everything until he's told to stop. And wow, there's a resistance. This is what resistance looked like. I mean, Vladimir Zelensky is actually right there with you, fighting right there with
yeah.
you, as opposed to the Trump going back to the White House and watching on TV, no matter how much he might have wanted to go to the Capitol. But I don't know. I just think that the examples around going on in the news have been actually pretty conspicuous in putting into focus the cowardice of the Republicans.
So your John Cornyn scenario is not likely to happen, is it? I mean,
No,
somebody saying, this is disqualifying. However, I can certainly imagine senior Republicans saying, you know what, it's time to move on. Okay, it's time to give him the gold watch. I can see that because what I pick up talking to Republicans is just kind of a weariness. They don't want to take a leading role, but boy, they would
no.
rather turn the page. They're looking at these poll numbers and they're saying that Joe Biden, who is like just absolutely cratered in the poll, is still leading
Hmm.
Donald Trump. So basically,
Yeah.
if Republicans begin to think, hey, you know what, we're going to win the midterms, we're going to win the presidency back with one possible exception. Donald Trump
Hmm.
may be the only guy who is going to blow it. And you look at these numbers. 66% of voters say that Trump attempted to overturn the election.
I know.
66% claimed the election was fraudulent.
It's
Um,
amazing.
there's the Politico Morning Consult poll. 44% of Republicans say that Trump lied about the election
I
results.
know. I mean,
So I want to get your reaction to this one, though. The New York Times Siena College poll shows that half of Republicans are looking for somebody else for president. So that's the anti-Trump news, but he
mhm.
still is way ahead of everybody. So half full, half empty. Where is this going? There's some big warning signs for Trump, but
Oh yeah.
if he still has 40 to 50% of the Republican electorate, he will sweep the primary field. So
He
where's this
will.
going, Mark?
I think if Trump wants the nomination, he will get it. I mean, that to me, I think, yes, there are warning signs, but the really only scenario where he is denied from in a primary is if okay, so Ron DeSantis decides that okay, I'm running for president, and Ted Cruz and Mike Pence decide, well, the only way Trump is going to win is if there's a crowded field that are of non-Trumpers. So I better step aside. I mean, is that something Ted Cruz is going to do? Is that something Mike Pence is going to do to sort of give up their dream for Ron DeSantis? I also think Ron DeSantis, and we were talking about this a little before. I mean, I don't think Ron DeSantis is the juggernaut everyone seems to think he is. I think if you talk to Republicans who served with him in Congress, he's got a weird personality. It's not warm. He's kind of a hard guy to warm up to. And a lot of Republican governors I've talked to have said the same thing. So you do wonder how a guy like him can scale on a national level. He also, his reelection is no short thing this year. I mean, he's pretty close to Charlie Crist, who is a deeply flawed candidate. But they're really close. So who knows? But think about like what Trump could do to him. But I think, I think there's a really good chance of a crowded field, which essentially will ensure Trump just sort of walking to victory. And even if there isn't a crowded field, I just sort of see him, really just in a much stronger position than a potential challenger if there were one or two.
I mean, to your point about DeSantis, I've kind of been walking around this by pointing out all of the other candidates, who have looked really good on paper and then,
Right.
go into the presidential campaign and fall apart. I mean, we all remember, President John Connally or President Fred Thompson. Remember when Rick Perry was, the leading candidate? I mean, you could do this over and over and over again. There's a big leap from being a governor to being a presidential candidate. And Ron DeSantis is, as one of his former colleagues described him, he's an unsmiling asshole. He doesn't just play one on television; he really is. And that personality is not necessarily going to play that well.
Yeah, I've heard the same. I mean, I personally don't see it, but what do I know? So, I mean, President Jeb Bush might have something to say about this.
President Jeb Bush, President Teddy Kennedy. I mean, you think of all of these guys. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Wesley Clark was the leading Democratic candidate for president.
Oh, my God. Yeah, no, I remember going to a rally for him that Ted Danson and Mary Steenburgen were in the middle of New Hampshire. I'm like, oh, he's got Ted Danson and Mary Steenburgen. I mean, some old Arkansas connection. And the Clark administration was great for a few weeks.
It was.
Up there in New Hampshire.
Mark Leibovich's new book is Thank You for Your Servitude, Donald Trump's Washington and the Price of Submission. You ought to read this in conjunction with the earlier classic, This Town. Mark is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thank you so much for coming on the Bulwark podcast today.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here, and we'll see you soon.
The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow. We'll do this all over again.
Hey guys, I'm Tom Welling. I used to play Clark Kent on Smallville.
I'm Michael Rosenbaum. I used to play Lex Luthor on Smallville. Join us every week as we go back.
Way back.
I'm excited.
I know. Are you? Can't wait.
Join Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum every week as they rewind every episode of Smallville and discuss their experiences with friends, fans, and co-stars. Talkville, the ultimate Smallville podcast. Listen anywhere you get your podcasts or watch on YouTube.